So we talked about this 51.6 year cycle and 103.2 and all that in the last iteration. I want you to realize that that cycle is there, has been there, and will continue to be there for as long as you're alive. So don't worry about that. The key thing is what we want to look at is particular themes. Okay, this theme that we're now going to emphasize is the whole idea of women's rights. And it's interesting how the push for women's rights to vote was begun with the beginning of the National Women's Party in June of 1916. And if you take that 103.2 years later, you go to August, September of 2019, so which is up in our time frame, and this is why it's important, because this particular theme kind of started then and began to percolate back in the 1920s. As a matter of fact, the original amendment, called the Equal Rights Amendment, was written in 1923, and in 1972 that it was first ratified by the Congress. And so Virginia ratified the amendment in 2020, and then a quorum of 38 states was finally reached there. So if you look at 1916 and then 2020 as key dates, there's a 103-year interval from the time that the Women's Rights Amendment was first thought up until the time it was first, the quorum of states ratified it. Now it's still kind of in limbo because they had decided back in the 1972 period that there was a time limit for the ratification process, which was already exceeded. However, it also looks good for the future because we have this 1920 date, which is very important, which would come out in 2023, and we have this 1923 date when the original amendment was written, and that comes out in 2026. So that means that about a year and a half, 2 years from now, there's one very important date where women's rights would be supported, and another one in 5 years from now, in 2026, where they would be supported. The reason I'm bringing all this up is because there's a much bigger cycle that relates to women's rights and empowerment that will be coming into focus more and more and more. And so this women's rights theme comes up this in 2020, and also the Black empowerment theme has become much stronger in the last year or so, and that's also coming across right now because of the 1968 connection to Martin Luther King and the iteration there of the death of John Lewis, which would mirror the death of Martin Luther King. And that was also a major event, and it was shown on History, and the funeral was very, very well attended. So this theme of women's rights and this theme of Black rights is all continuing. Where does it lead? Well, what's interesting is that there's some unusual astrological combination that has not happened in the United States history yet. And it comes in 2041. You have Jupiter, Saturn, and Ketu, the south node of the moon, all together in the sign of Libra. And Libra is ruled by Venus. And Libra also has to do with harmony and balance and creating peace in the world and such. And that combination of Jupiter, Saturn, and Ketu there is a extremely significant point in history that is likely to increase and expand the power of women, the equality of women, the rule of women. There may be a female president coming in the next few years, and I have an idea about that as well. But the point being, for example, this particular combination was useful at the time of Queen Elizabeth in 1604, and even more interesting, back in ancient Egypt, Hatshepsut, who was the first female pharaoh of note. There was one before her, but she was the most notable, and she came along at a time where this particular configuration happened. And at that time, and at other times when Queen Elizabeth was around, there were times of sustained peace and harmony in the society. And in Hatshepsut's time, the Egyptians were trading with other countries all over the existent world, and in other positive. There were very few wars. Things kind of cooled down into a more sensible, peaceful world, and that's where we're headed. So even though there's a lot of chaos and tumult in the immediate situation, that is not going to be permanent. As a matter of fact, 2023, 2026, these are signposts of times when women's rights will be empowered, the Equal Rights Amendment, and any other additional documentation and legal requirements for equality for blacks and for women will be coming more into focus. On this theme of the 51.6-year cycle related to women's rights and equal rights in general, by giving some more specifics and some more connections between various people in the past and the present. So one of the things that came up was that 1920 was a very significant year for the women's rights movement, and the projection 103.2 years later, we're expecting 2023 to be another very significant point. And note that the middle between those two was 1972, 51.6 years after the 1920 date, and that was when Congress actually approved that the Women's Rights Amendment could go forward if they had the appropriate support from the states, which has not yet happened yet, but I think it will happen by 2023. Okay. Now what's interesting and in line with all this was some of the most famous women in history align with 2023 by cycles. And we had mentioned that Queen Elizabeth was obviously a very powerful and very successful queen, and during her time it was considered the golden age of Britain, and during the time of Hatshepsut, we have also a very, very special time in Egypt, and there was also another very, very powerful woman in halfway between the 1768 year cycle back from forward from Hatshepsut leads us to Aurelian, who was an emperor, one of the most famous emperors in ancient Rome, and he was known, after all was said and done, as one of the most successful emperors. He was called the Uniter of the World, and he was killed in 275 AD, 274 AD, and his wife Severina was the empress, and she was the first and only female empress of the Roman Empire until that time. And after that time, what was interesting is the Eastern Roman Empire, which was seated in Byzantium, which we now call Constantinople, had a very powerful female empress called Theodora from 527 AD to 548 AD, and she was renowned as one of the most successful emperors in history and created a positive trend in Rome at that time, in the Eastern Empire of Rome. And so the ancient cycle of the Egyptian pharaoh connecting with the most famous female emperor empress in ancient Rome, connecting with Queen Elizabeth. And the reason for the Queen Elizabeth thing was very simple. 9 times 51.6 years, going forward from 1558, which was when she was coronated, when the coronation happened, leads you to 2023. And if you go forward from there till 2041, that aligns with all the other major empowered women in the history of the world. And it should be, again, a time of great success and expanded rights and influence of women in general. In China, in the same sequence where we have the 154.8 years, which is 51.6 times 3, we have Dowry Cixi in China, which was one of the only and most powerful women empresses in China, again in line with the 51-year cycle. And I think so we're looking at a time coming where there's a tremendous overlap of very, very significant times, most of which were considered successful periods of great peace and prosperity. The period in ancient Egypt was one of the best periods in ancient Egypt. The period with Queen Elizabeth was wonderful. The period of Severina was one of the best times for the recycling of the power of Rome and the increasing success of the Roman Empire after what was called the crisis of the 3rd century had demanded Rome have tremendous challenges, as we have been having in the United States now. Another time we'll discuss the analog of the connection between the Roman Empire and the United States of America in terms of the birth of the Roman Empire and the birth of the United States. But on that note, I just wanted to add some of these points because 2023 lines up with several major time points when women have come into power, and it's likely that the Equal Rights Amendment finally will become a constitutional reality 2 years from now, a little less than that. All right, thanks a lot. And if you like this, let us know. If you have any comments, please let us know.